probably this morning than it would have been last week. And it's definitely, I hope, Lord willing, more timely than what it would even be next week. But I love how we began this series 11 months ago. July of 24 is when we jumped into the book of Acts, and we've taken a few breaks at different times to do different things, and I've been out of the pulpit, and other people have spoken. But all that's just incredible to me that when we started 11 months ago and the breaks that we've taken leaves us at the point where we're at today, not knowing what the last 12 hours, much less the last few weeks, would have in store for us. And so it's just incredible to me to see, because typically what I do on Sunday mornings, I get up before everybody else in the house and I spend time in prayer and looking at my sermon. And I was doing that this morning. In light of last night, it amazed me how God used that. Again, 11 months ago, this started, kind of was set into motion, and again, the breaks for Christmas and different people speaking, and then this is the text we land on today. So I want you to know, with very few exceptions, and I will actually let you know what I've kind of added to or what I put into my sermon this morning as compared to what was in place again before yesterday evening. So with that being said, my opening statement for you guys was going to be, if I hadn't said everything I just said, we are living in some troubling times. Amen? We are living in some troubling times. Everywhere we look, anything that we listen to, there's bad or at least concerning news or events unfolding before us. Riots, wars, to name a few, intolerance, hatred, there's sickness, there's moral failures, unfortunately, everywhere we look, and there's just so much more. Right? And what I wrote down was Israel and Iran and our potential involvement with that, Russia and Ukraine, no kings 2, COVID, cancer, idolatry, and again, we just kind of keep going in all these categories and subcategories of things that are just troubling to say the least, and potentially a lot more depth to those things. And I don't know about you, but me, when I think about these things, and again, I just don't want to focus on Iran or anything like that, but just in the world's condition, like where we find ourselves in the middle or the midst of these things occurring. And again, for some of us, like there's all these things occurring, and life will continue to occur over the next several days, weeks, months. And I feel like in these moments, and you've heard me say this or ask these questions before, we're left at a point of saying, like, what do I do with this? Right, what do I do with this? How do I respond to this? What is it that I'm supposed to say? What am I supposed to think? What am I supposed to do? Right, and if that's not enough, there's this added layer of complexity that no matter what you do, no matter how you respond, no matter what you think, no matter what you say to pretty much any of those events, there's at least somebody in your circle, somebody in your life that's going to say, believe that you're absolutely wrong for the way you responded, what you said, what you did, what you thought, even though you might have believed it to be true. And all this at times can be concerning, alarming, and potentially overwhelming. I cannot tell you how many times, like in the last several years, to be honest, but definitely weeks and months, that I've shared on social media, or not I've shared, but I've seen shared on social media. And I added this morning, and to be honest, especially over the last 12 hours, these two passages that I want to share with you. I'm sure you've seen them as well. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 8, this is Jesus speaking. And he says, see that no one leads you astray. See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Verse 6 says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. Verse 7 is the one I think I've seen the most. It says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but beginning of the birth pains. Right? Has anybody else seen that on social media recently? Yeah, I mean, like, again, before last night, I was seeing this pretty regularly, and definitely since things have been kind of interesting in Israel, and then but before that, the Ukraine, and like just all this stuff, right? We see these passages, and I'm not saying they're out of context, but again, we have this passage, but we also have in 2 Timothy 3, I'm going to read verses, I guess 1 through 7. It says, but understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins, and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. So, I feel like these two passages, right, when I read these or when I hear them, I can't help but to think that we're closer now to the end than the beginning, right? And I don't think I'm alone in that kind of thinking, because I remember my grandparents, and this was obviously years ago, and they would say something to the effect of, we're closer today than we've ever been. And I'd say, well, of course that's true, right? Because it's not yesterday now. So we're always one day closer. But I think, too, like even folks who, I'll just be transparent, even folks who aren't, I don't know, maybe they would consider themselves Christians, maybe they wouldn't, but I see them quoting these last couple of verses in the last several weeks and months, and they're talking about perhaps the end is coming near and all these kinds of things. You better get right. And again, I'm reading this, I'm going, what? Like last week I saw what you posted too, and now we're posting this also. And but like this is coming to our mind. And perhaps even me reading these passages or even the prayer this morning for what's going on, along with the recent events in our world, have you even a little unsettled, even this morning. And I want you to understand that that's not my intent this morning. It wasn't when I started writing the sermon. It's even not yet this morning. And nothing I've said to you so far is anything that I've changed from when I began to write the sermon several days ago. That brings the question to my mind, right? All this that's going on. One that we probably all asked at one point, right? With everything going on, where do I go from here? What do I do? What do I say? What do I think? And I want us to keep that in mind as we jump into Acts chapter 21. If you want to turn there, that's where we'll be pretty much for the rest of the sermon today. Acts chapter 21. So again, with everything going on, right, with the struggles that are before us, whether that be health problems before us, whether that be the worldly events before us that have unfolded in the last 12 hours, whether that be the things that have been going on in the world for much longer than that. This is the context of where I want us to be, right? The angle by which I want us to approach today's passage. So we're going to pick up in the middle of actually chapter 21 there. So I want to kind of bring us up to speed. If you remember last week, we had talked about Paul was in Ephesus, and he was there encouraging the elders. He was speaking to the church elders and trying to encourage them. Then in verse 21, Paul's making his way towards Jerusalem. Before he arrives there, he's going to stop in Caesarea. While he's there, a prophet actually comes and gives Paul some concerning news, I would say the least, and he even gives him a little bit of a demonstration. So in Acts chapter 21, verse 10 and 11 is where we'll start. It says, while we were staying for many days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. I'm pretty sure that we could probably all put this in the category of not good news, right? Things that we weren't probably looking forward to. He had a plan. He had a plan to go to Jerusalem, and he had just received word that if he indeed went to Jerusalem, he would end up bound, most likely in the hands of those who have already persecuted him, that had physically caused him harm already. And I think while different for sure, Paul's situation is, at least in a way, similar to where we find ourselves today. Right? Knowing kind of what is coming. And the reason I initially wanted to present the verse in Matthew to you guys is to kind of understand what is coming. Right? I don't think that's come to complete fruition yet. Like I believe it's still to come, at least in ways and layers. And so knowing what is to come, knowing that things are likely to get worse, or at least remain uncomfortable for us, knowing that things, at least in the immediate future, are not likely to get any better. And I say this in reference, again, back to those two passages. Like, we know what is to come. Right? We know what's going to kind of unfold before us, perhaps, as long as the Lord tarries. Like we know, as the Lord even promised us himself, that we're going to have trials and tribulations and difficulties, knowing all of that, right? And that's kind of where Paul finds himself. He has a plan, he has a purpose, he knows what he wants to do, and he knows also that if he does those things, there's going to be persecution that comes about, that life's going to get a little difficult. Things are going to change for him. And again, for him and for us, we ask those questions. Where do we go from here? What do we do? What do I think? What do I say? How do I live? Like, what does this look like for me? And I want to dig deep into this morning that while our actions are important, and I don't want to minimize that, our actions are certainly important, but what I believe matters the most is the positions of our hearts. I believe that always matters, but very specifically as we consider what's happening around us and the position of our hearts, both this morning and on Monday morning and every other day of the week, it's impacted by our perspective. And just to be clear, perspective matters a lot. So when I say perspective, what I'm saying is this really how we view the world. And I'm going to make a statement you may disagree with, and that's okay. But when I say perspective and how we view the world, I want to add a little bit more to that. It's how we choose to view the world that we're living in. It's how we choose to view the world that we're living in. Not just the physical things that are happening, right? What we see happening in front of us, but also the things that are happening in the spiritual world, things that we may not be able to see with our physical eye. Everything as a whole, and it encompasses our view of life and of all of the situations that life throws at us or gives to us, however you want to look at that, both good and bad. And it also helps us to understand, or at least to try to accept the why behind a lot of the what that actually occurs in our life. Again, I say our perspective matters. Several years ago, I heard a sermon where Andy Stanley, he was talking about perspective, and he used the analogy of a window, looking through a window. We understand that the window really doesn't dictate what's on the other side of the window, right? The window out this way, it doesn't dictate the cars that are actually on the other side of the window. But it can impact how we see what is there, right? And so this is a few things that I added this morning. If I'm looking out of a window and in those rocks, like there are at times, unfortunately, I saw a snake, I would be okay because there's definitely something between me and that snake, right? I could appreciate, much like at a zoo or something like that, like maybe the beauty, I would debate that a little bit, but it's doing its thing. It's leaving me alone. But again, there's the snake is there, I'm here, and there's something in between us. And if that window were tinted extremely dark, perhaps I don't see what's on the other side of that window. Or maybe it's you're at home and there's been this fresh, beautiful blanket of snow that's layered down. Obviously not happening today. But I can look outside of that window and appreciate the beauty of the snow, right? I remember when I stopped working on the ambulance full time, and I stopped in August, and I was sitting in my office on the 4th story, and it began to snow like crazy. And snow just continued to fall and fall and fall and fall. And I turned around several times, and I'd look out that window, and I remember thinking, I'm really glad I'm not on the ambulance today. But I could appreciate the beauty of the snow because that thing, the window in between me and the snow, right? Change it up a little bit. If you put me outside next to my car and then I see a snake, things are different. I'm no longer okay with that snake. I don't want that snake to exist any longer. The snake was there. I was here. There was something in between us. It helped me to, again, I can see through there, but yet know I'm safe because that window, if you will, The same would be true if I'm out in the snow. I'm probably no longer going to be talking about its beauty and all this kind of stuff if I'm out there shoveling it, trying to get our cars out of the driveway or something. And again, the window concept doesn't change what's out there. It doesn't change what's in here, but it can change the way in which we view what is happening. And this is the way perspective works in our life. Right? Paul is faced with what appears to be a pretty big problem. He's doing what God has called him to do, literally. Right? He's made a plan that makes sense to him. This is kind of the path I'm going to take. Here's the places I'm going to go. He was ready to go to Jerusalem, and out of nowhere, at least seemingly, something happens. Very specifically, Paul is told that if he continues his plans, he will, once again, he will endure hardship and persecution. Church, there's not a doubt in my mind that every single one of us in the room, those that are watching online, that we've experienced something similar. Now, obviously, I hope it's not that exact situation, but I think we've probably all been there to some degree. We've been going about our life. We've been doing, I don't want to say our own thing in a bad sense, but we've been living the life that God's called us to, whatever that looks like for us individually. And then out of nowhere, something happens, and our plans are put on pause or potentially even completely derailed. First and foremost, I want to remind us this morning that our current situation, our current struggle, individually, corporately, as a world, whatever it may be, it doesn't have to be the end of our story. Right? Whatever's on the other side of the window, if you will, it doesn't have to end there. That's not where it has to stop. And this is no matter how it may feel or seem. And hear me out, even despite what other people may be saying about what's on the other side of your perspective window. In Acts chapter 21, verse 12, it says, when we heard this, people there urged him not to go to Jerusalem. Right? When we heard this, we urged him not to go to Jerusalem. The people that were in Paul's corner, the ones that were there for the ride, if you will, as far as ministry goes, the ones that were closest to him, the ones that he probably was inclined to go to get some advice when things were going crazy, those kinds of people, and they're saying, hey, don't go. Don't do it. The reason that this verse is important is because we get to choose our perspective, as I said before, but our perspective is one that we choose to live by, one that we choose to accept, one that we choose to apply to our own lives. And the voices in our lives, good or bad, can oftentimes very easily influence our perspective. And so it matters which voices we're listening to. It matters which voices we allow to speak into our lives. And I've shared this with you so many times. Like, I think that all of us can understand that there's been times in our lives when we've listened to other people and we didn't go with our gut or perhaps even what the Lord wanted for us, and we've done something different, and we've ended up in a difficult spot because of that. But I hope, just as true, you have times in your life where you listen to wisely, godly counsel, and you've ended up in the spot you're supposed to be. The voices that speak into our lives can often, either good or bad, and often easily impact our perspective. Despite the situation that Paul had in front of him, and despite the fact that Paul, or rather his friends, didn't want him to go, it's important to understand that God's call on Paul's life, God's charge on Paul's life had not changed one bit. I also added this morning that despite the significant turmoil that's unfolded in the last 12 hours, God's call and his charge on your life and my life, it has not changed one bit. What unfolded last night did not catch God off guard one bit. He's not trying to figure out what is his next move, what does he do now. The questions that we often ask ourselves about our own life, right? Where do we do? Where do we go? What do I say? What do I think? How do I respond? Like, that is not God. He has not changed one bit. Life, it's going to ebb, it's going to flow. And those changes, right? And the situations, they do not change who we are in God either. They don't change who we are in God, and they certainly do not change God. God's call on Paul's life was to preach the gospel, right? It was to make much of Jesus. And the situations, yes, plural, the situations that he had gone through and that he had found himself in, none of those had changed who he was in Christ, and none of them changed who God was. And thus the reason, at least my opinion, that he was able to continue to push through, to persevere, to keep going, to go on another journey, to continue to reach the lost. And in the same way, the circumstances and situations that we find ourselves in don't change the charge that God has put on our life. At a minimum, to be salt, at a minimum, to be light, ministers of reconciliation to a dark and dying world. Jumping back into kind of the original stuff that I had for us this morning, at this particular moment in Paul's life, that wasn't looking the way that he had probably hoped that it would, or at least at a minimum planned that it would. But just because it looks or feels different doesn't mean that God's no longer in control, or that you are outside of God's will for your life. But hear me out. This type of understanding, it does take perspective. It does take perspective. My challenge for us this morning is that we, every one of us, that when we're faced with a difficult situation of life, that we would consider our perspective, right? When we are faced with a difficult situation, when life gets tough, when the world's going crazy, and maybe even more crazy than it typically is, like when we contemplate those things, my ask, my hope, my prayer is that we first consider our perspective. How am I going to look at what's occurring? Like, what is the window by which I'm going to look through and see what's occurring in my life? I want to look and see how Paul responded to the news that he had received, that he'd be bound up and all this kind of stuff. And I want to see how he responded also to his friends. In verse 13, it said, "Then Paul answered, 'What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart?' He says, 'For I am ready not only to be imprisoned, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus.'" To put it mildly, Paul, he was not fazed by the prophecy, and he was not fazed by what his friends had said. It's not because he didn't believe that the prophecy would come true, but because the perspective that he had, it allowed him to say, if going back to prison is what's in store for me, then I guess it's a good day to go to prison. All right? Or even to the extent that if dying is what God has in store for me, well, I guess it's a good day for that too. As long as it was in service to the Lord, as long as he was following through with what God had called him to do, this was his perspective. In Philippians 1:21, Paul speaking to the church there, he says, "But for me to live, it's Christ." But then he says, "To die is gain." Again, perspective. Romans 8:18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, they're not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to me." Again, perspective. Somebody who's put into jail, beaten, ridiculed, shipwrecked, left for dead multiple times. Like, this is the life he lives, and this is the kind of stuff he says. But I think, again, Paul's perspective was intact. He knew who he was in God. He knew who God was to him. He knew what God had called him to do. And it's not just that he was willing to talk the talk, as we saw here in these two verses. Again, like, he could say that, he could preach that, and that'd be really cool. People would tweet that out and everything. But then what about when he actually was faced with a situation? Right? In Paul's life, it wasn't just words that he spoke. It wasn't just encouragement that he gave to the church, but it was literally the life that he lived. And we see that playing out here in Acts, that Paul was willing to walk the walk. Paul's perspective, no matter what life throws my way, right? No matter what life throws my way, if God's will for my life, then I'm in. Whatever that looks like, whatever that feels like, however comfortable or uncomfortable that may be, I'm in. What Paul understood and what he put into practice is that, and that we need to understand, us as Christians, individuals, yes, as the church, that we need to understand every single day is that he had a choice. He had a choice of how he could view the world around him and what was occurring. What he was going through, what he'd been through, what was up in front of him, whatever may come, he had a choice. And his choice was to view life through the lens of which God being in control. And that his will, God's will, was more important than what Paul had planned. And God's will is more important than what you and I have planned. And while this view is important for him and even for us, it also impacts those that are around us. In verse 14, it says, "And since he would not be persuaded, we ceased and said, the will of the Lord be done." Let the will be done. What Paul was saying, and again, more importantly, what he was actually living out in front of them, it was impacting those that were closest to him. It's not that these people didn't know Paul. It's not that they never heard him say some of these things, or they've not been around for some of the other crazy, in a good way, stuff that he'd done. Like, this wasn't necessarily new to these folks. But understand that Paul continues because the life that he lives, yes, the words that he said, but the life that he lives is impacting those around him. It wasn't a show. And for him and for them, it was contagious. And it's my prayer that our lives would be lived in light of this perspective. On good days and bad days, in sickness and in health, and when things make sense and when things don't make sense, that God, may your will be done in my life. And I pray that it's more than just words. Again, sometimes talking the talk is relatively easy. And I pray that it's a lifestyle. And here's why this matters. Right? Here's why all of this matters. Because, and I'm not going to read it to us for time's sake, but you can read through verse 30 to 35 and see that what was prophesied occurs to Paul. He goes to Jerusalem. This is what happens. Right? Exactly what he said would happen. It happens. And our perspective matters this morning because each one of us is going to experience life. We're going to go through good and the bad, and the world around us is going to continue to crumble, and things are going to go good and bad, and maybe from bad to worse, or whatever the situation may be, but life's going to continue to play out in front of us. And while we look through the window of our life to see what's unfolding, we have the choice to view it in our perspective. And is our perspective going to be one of God is in control, so whatever come they may, and whatever comes, we'll deal with it because God's got this. His will matters. Or do we approach life, do we view through the window of, this is not what I had planned. This is not good. I don't like this. This is not going to work, right? And like two totally different directions that our life would go, our thinking would go, dependent upon the perspective that we have. Remember what I said before, perspective doesn't change the situation that's in front of us. It doesn't change what's on the other side of the window, but it certainly changes how we view it. And again, our view, if it's one of this, as long as God's in it, as long as this is His will for my life, God is in control. So who am I, right? Who am I to try to do this or do that? God's in control. His will is greater than our will for our own life. And that does not mean that life will be easy, as we all know and we've all experienced. And our situation itself will not change, most likely. But I assure you, I 100% assure you, that even though the situation may not change, your life will be better because of the perspective that you have, viewing life through the lens of knowing that Christ is in control. I want to close by making just a few statements. First, God first in our life doesn't mean that we're not allowed to pray for our situation to change. I think we see all throughout the Bible where folks encountered difficulty and they prayed for God to change it. And we see all throughout the Bible times that God intervened and He changed that situation. And probably just as equally, we see all throughout the Bible where folks prayed, they lamented, they sacrificed to God, and their situation was the same. Nothing changed. I think we see biblical evidence that we could and should pray for our situation to change. Philippians 4:6, it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, in every situation, in every difficulty, in every struggle, with every diagnosis, with every bad thing, or even every good thing that happens in life, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God." I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this guy was talking about how if you have kids, of course you can relate, kids don't hesitate to ask for what they want, yes? And you can give them, this is what he was saying, he said, you can give them pretty much a yes day. You can go all day long, right? And you can say, yes, you can have this. Yes, you can buy that toy. Yes, you can do this. Yes, you can eat that, whatever. Right? And then you bought them that toy that they didn't need, that you told them they didn't need, and that they're not going to even play with probably for 20 minutes after you've gotten it for them. But he said, even after you've given them that toy, they're going to turn around and look right at you and say, well, will you carry it for me? Right? And so kids aren't afraid to ask for what they want, right? And I know we can get into parenting, which we're not doing that this morning, but kids aren't afraid to ask their parents for what they want. Hear me out. We should not be afraid or hesitate to ask our Father for exactly what we want. You say, well, maybe that sounds selfish. Cool. Have you had a kid before? Right? We can ask God for exactly what we want. And I want you to hear me. We can believe God to do exactly that. And we can believe that God has the power and the authority and the ability to do just that. And I will continue to pray with you, for my own life. I'll continue to be selfish and ask God to fix my life, even the mess that I've made of it. And I would encourage you to do the same. Continue to push forward in prayer. Let your requests be made known to God. But perspective comes into play when we pray for what's on the other side of that window to change. And it hasn't. And maybe it won't. That perspective of saying, God's not good. I must have messed up. He's probably paying me back for when I did that. I didn't give enough, pray enough, do enough. Right? If we choose to live by that perspective, first and foremost, that's not God's character. And it just pushes us into this hole of isolation and hole of distrust and this hole of not understanding. Not that we have to understand the why, but the understanding of who God is himself. Or we've prayed and we've asked God and we've prayed and we've asked God, and what's on the other side of that window, it doesn't change. And then we say, well, God, I don't understand it. I really don't like it. But God, I trust that you're in control. And God, even on good days, yes, but even on these bad days, God, your will be done. And that perspective is what I'm talking about. That's the perspective that Paul had. That's the perspective that Paul demonstrated that, okay, if this is it, this is what he's got for me, then this is what it is. And I promise you this morning that as we go through life, and again, like 11 months ago, all this was set into motion, that this morning that we would be talking about this. You and I can't control what happens in the Middle East. We can't control what happens in our neighborhoods. But we control the perspective by which we view that which is occurring in the world around us. And I choose this morning, because we get a choice. I choose this morning to live my life looking through the window of God is good. And his will is supreme. And I want to submit to that. And so I'm going to pray for what's on the other side of the window to change. In the meantime, in the waiting, in the struggle, God, you're still good. God, you're still worthy of it all. And God, you're going to have to help me. You're going to have to help me navigate what's on the other side of that. I believe he's faithful to do just that. If you're able and willing, let's stand this morning. We'll go before the Lord one more time, an opportunity to praise or response to his word.